Welcome to this e-therapy webinar on OT and PT telepractice in the school setting. Here is a quick overview of what we'll be discussing. We will review some important points about working in the school setting, writing IEP goals, bridging the distance when you're not physically there with the student, collaborating with caregivers, and then also some therapy tips and ideas for PT and OT in telepractice and what you can expect to learn from this presentation. After completion of this webinar, the participant should be able to write a goal based on the SMART goal method, describe the purpose of a therapy toolkit, and identify at least 3 activities that can be used during a teletherapy session to target PT and/or OT goals. So let's start with some basics about teletherapy in schools. There are various types of student and school setups you may work with in telepractice. Some students may be attending a brick and mortar school where they're physically in a school building. And in that situation, the students might be shuttled to and from the computer by an aide or a teacher who helps to make sure the student gets to the computer at the right time to meet with you. And the other broad type of students we work with are virtual. So these may be students who are attending a virtual or cyber academy or doing some type of hybrid school model where they are logging into their teletherapy session with you from their home. And most of you are probably already familiar with online school models and how that all works. So let's dive into our first big topic here, which is timelines and processes in the school setting. This can be really different from the clinical setting. So if you were coming from a more clinical or outpatient type of background, this is something that can take some getting used to and is very important to take note of because there are some differences in the school setting with timelines and processes for evaluations, annual IEP meetings, and temporary IEPs. Let's take a look at more information about evaluations in the school setting. Evals are completed every 3 years. So if you're working in a school, you may get a notification about a student's triennial that is coming up. Triennial, meaning every 3 years. That means it's their triennial evaluation where the team is going to do a comprehensive assessment to look at all of the students' skills. Students can be evaluated more frequently than every 3 years if needed, so we don't have to wait 3 years if updated info is really needed or if the parent requests an evaluation before that 3 years time frame is up. But that is something that would be decided and coordinated by the IEP team and case manager. So not something that you as a clinician in the schools would decide to do on your own. Also, the student must meet the district's qualifying criteria to receive services. So if you were coming from a more clinical background, you may be more familiar with a setting where you're relating just individually with the client and the caregiver, if it's a pediatric setting. In this type of clinical setup, you would likely do an evaluation when you get started with the client. You look at their strengths and weaknesses, and you review the results just with the client if it's an adult, or the caregiver if it's a pediatric setting. Then you are deciding together what makes sense for therapy. You may be looking at qualifying criteria for Medicaid or insurance, or if the client is private pay, that might not even be as big of a consideration. In the school setting, it's a different approach. The school setting is offering students what we call FAPE, free and appropriate public education. And in order to help all students access that education appropriately, the school provides related services such as OT, PT, or speech therapy. So the purpose of those services is to help the students access the academics and be successful in the school setting. It's really all about helping the student to be successful in accessing the academics. So there are really specific qualifying criteria that the student has to meet in order to receive the services. We can't just decide to provide OT or PT services for a student because we think, hey, it might be good for this kiddo. They have to meet those qualifying criteria. And evaluations typically do involve a formal evaluation. So this is talking about standardized testing And it is very important to look at standardized measures, to look at those qualifying criteria. But we don't just look at standard scores. We also consider informal assessments and observations, how they're performing in the classroom, consultation with the parent and teachers. We take all of these factors together to decide with the IEP team if a student qualifies and if they would benefit from therapy services. So keep in mind, qualifying criteria is really important, but we don't just look at standard scores, and we don't qualify a student for related services based only on one standard score. We look at the whole picture of the child. So be sure to look at the qualifying criteria for OT or PT for your particular school or district to see what the requirements and guidelines are for your particular school setting. So, evaluations do most often involve standardized assessments. However, sometimes evals can be completed as a review of records. And that would be where you are writing up a report, but you're not doing formal testing. You're just doing an observation of the student, a review of their previous history and their previous evaluation results, and looking at their present levels of functioning. Typically, that's only done if there's a clear indication of a continued qualification for services. And this would be specifically requested by the school. So these aren't things you're going to just decide to do on your own. These are things you're going to get a referral for and be requested to do through the school. So that leads me into the next point. You must have parent consent and referral for the evaluation. You can't just see a new student on your caseload and think, I'd really like to get some updated information. Okay, I think I'm going to go ahead and start doing an evaluation on this student. You have to have a referral and consent to do that. And typically, it's just done every 3 years, as in the triennial evaluation. But if you find that there's a real need for updated assessment information, you can always go and talk to the IEP team about doing an evaluation sooner if you really need more updated information. And the team can consider if that's appropriate, and the IEP coordinator or case manager can help to get whatever paperwork is required to proceed with that. Next, it's important to note that independent contractors typically purchase their own evaluation materials. But when you work with e-therapy, we do help to support therapists in accessing those materials and navigating the whole process of getting set up to complete online evaluations. Some states do have specific requirements that OT or PT evals be completed on site, especially for PT. Those rules are changing now, but it is something important to keep in mind. So don't just assume that it's okay to do an online evaluation for your school. Make sure that it is part of the guidelines and approved by that particular state board. And some schools might have an on site person already who does their evaluations, or there may be a specific online therapist that's already assigned to do all of the evaluations. And that therapist may do the eval and then pass on the information to you. And your account manager will let you know what the plan is for who is completing evaluations and how that will all work at your particular school. Annual IEP meetings. These are completed at least once per year, sometimes more often if needed. In telepractice, the therapist attends the meeting over the phone or through video conference. So typically with our homeschooled students who are attending a virtual or cyber academy, that virtual school will have a conference line already set up for the purposes of meetings and IEPs. They may also have an online classroom set up where they can post all of the documents for the team to review. And the case manager or your account manager would let you know what the conference line is to call in for the meeting. Or sometimes you can attend via video conference. And this is done sometimes with our brick and mortar schools. If the student attends a physical brick and mortar school, then the IEP team may be there in person, sitting around a table for the meeting, and then you could just call in or video conference in to attend with the group. As for scheduling those meetings, it's really important to respond promptly to those IEP meeting emails. Of course, it's important to respond promptly to all of your emails, but the team may be on a tight timeline to get that meeting scheduled and get it completed. The school is required to meet those certain timelines legally, and it's a lot to coordinate to get all the team members on the same page. So just be really mindful of that and respond quickly to those emails. If you have a conflicting therapy session at the time of the scheduled meeting, you can reschedule your therapy session as needed to attend those IEP meetings. The therapist typically completes their portion of the IEP prior to the meeting. So, if there's an online system that you have access to for that school, then you would likely be going into that system, completing your present levels, mentioning about your observations of the student, their current strengths and weaknesses, progress toward previous goals, and recommended new goals. And the goals must be approved by the IEP team. So, this is another kind of mind shift that we have to make if you're coming from a more clinical background. When you're coming from a clinical background or maybe a hospital or outpatient type setting, you may be used to just adding new goals as needed and the decision being primarily up to you, along with the client or the parent and caregiver. But it's by and large up to you in those settings, oftentimes, to add new goals. In the school setting, that's really different. The goals must be approved by the IEP team, and the main time that new goals are added is at that annual IEP meeting. So typically, we wait for that annual IEP meeting to add your new recommended goals. However, if you get a new student and you begin working with the student and find, gosh, these current goals that this student has really aren't appropriate anymore. He's made this good progress, or he's regressed, or whatever the situation might be, you may realize the goals aren't appropriate for whatever reason and feel that they really need to be updated. So, in that situation, you should first take a look at the timeline and see, when is this student's next IEP meeting? Look and see, oh, if they have an annual IEP meeting coming up maybe next month or pretty soon, then you could just start taking some baseline data and planning for what those updated goals should be, and then you'll be ready with your recommended goals at that upcoming meeting. Now, if the next IEP meeting is a long ways off and the current goals are really inappropriate, then you could talk to the IEP team and let them know, I really think we need to update these goals for OT or PT, and here's why. Here's my justification for why. Then they may be able to go ahead and schedule a meeting sooner to talk about that. Or occasionally at some schools, you may be able to add new goals outside of an IEP meeting with an amendment. So that's something you could talk about with the school and see if that's a possibility. One last note here about the annual IEP. At times, you and the team may decide to change the service frequency at that IEP meeting. Maybe the student was being seen every week, but she's made good progress, and the team decides that one time per month is more appropriate for the new IEP. These changes go into effect once that IEP has been signed and completed. In some situations, that may happen all during that meeting, so that the changes go into effect that very day or the next day. At other times, they may have to track down a parent for a signature, or they may be waiting on some other paperwork to complete the IEP. So, if changes are made, such as to the service time, be sure to inquire about when those changes will actually go into effect. And be sure not to make those changes to how often you see the student until the update to the IEP is official. So, you don't want to change your therapy schedule with the student until you have confirmation that the new IEP service time has actually gone into effect. You can simply ask the case manager or IEP coordinator when that change will be official. Once again, oftentimes the changes do go into effect right away, but sometimes they don't, depending on other factors. So it's something you definitely want to be aware of. Now let's look at temporary or transfer IEPs. So this happens when a student transfers in from another district and the parent reports that the student has been receiving services or special ed support services at the previous school. And we run into this at all school districts across the country, but in particular, it happens a lot with the virtual or cyber academies. And that's because in cyber academy settings, the students are moving in and out. They might have been attending a local brick and mortar school, realize that wasn't a good fit, so then they transfer to a virtual school and start doing homeschool. So we tend to get a lot of temporary IEPs. So a typical situation might be that the student transfers in, and when they transfer in, the parent says something to the effect of, "Oh, yeah, Johnny was receiving OT at his previous school." And that may be the only information that the new school has to go off of. But based on that parent report, they have to go ahead and start providing those services temporarily to the student while they gather more information. So when the student enrolls and the new school gets that information, the school will hold a temporary IEP meeting right away. Usually it's within the first week of that student enrolling in the new program. The temporary IEP is to provide comparable services to what the child was previously receiving in their previous school. And that's while the new district gathers records and determines appropriate placement in the new school. The school and providers have 30 calendar days before a placement IEP meeting is held. So you have 30 calendar days to review previous records, hopefully meet with the student and talk with the parent or teacher to see what their current skill level is, determine if services are even appropriate, and if so, what goals you want to recommend. Now, that's a lot to happen in 30 days. So it's really important to use that month to review any available records that you can get, and the school should provide those to you. That is, if they can even get the records. You want to observe the child and consult with the family to determine what those appropriate goals and service frequency might be. This can be really challenging because those records might not be available or the frequency may be minimal. So, what I mean by that is on this temporary IEP that they put in place right when the student enrolls, there will be a service time on there. And it might say 30 minutes once a week, which would mean during this month, this 30 calendar days, you could see that student 30 minutes once a week. Or the service frequency might just be for one session, or it might just be for one 15-minute consultation with the parent or teacher. So that might be all you get during that 30 calendar days. So check what the referral is, check the frequency, look at those records right away if they're available, and get in contact with the parent, especially if it's a virtual or cyber academy student. If it's a physical brick and mortar school, also be sure to talk with the teacher as soon as possible. This 30 calendar days can go really quickly. So use the time as efficiently as you can to get as much information from the parents, the student, teachers, previous records, and try to determine if continued services are appropriate, and if so, what are some goals that you can go ahead and put in place, with the understanding that sometimes in this type of situation, you're not going to have that much information to go off of. So do your very best to write individualized specific goals to meet the student's needs. And then understand that as you go along with the student and work with them, if you realize, oh, I really need to tweak this goal to make it more appropriate and to make it what the student really needs to address, then you could go back to the IEP team and say, hey, now that I've had more time to work with the student, I think these goals would be more appropriate. And here's my justification why. Can we do an amendment to the IEP? Or could we have an updated meeting so that we can get these more appropriate goals in place? Okay, so speaking of IEP goals, OT and PT goals in the school setting are to support academic success. And I touched on that before. This is something that is a different approach from working in a clinical environment if you're coming from that type of background. So this is something you really have to wrap your brain around, that the goals must be directly related to the child's ability to engage in school activities. It's all about supporting the academic success. Now that can be across various environments. We're talking about the classroom, the playground, the cafeteria, and the social components related to being in a school environment. So all of those things are taken into consideration. But this is something we really have to focus on, is that the goals are to support academic success in the school environment. And we want to use a SMART goal writing plan. So you may be familiar with this already. SMART is an acronym for specific, measurable, achievable, relevant, and time bound. And this is a really good method for writing goals. So let's break it down here. Specific. You want to identify the specific task the student needs to be able to complete. So nail down exactly what it is you're trying to get the student to do. And once again, ensure that it relates to supporting the student's ability to engage in school activities. Like I said, it could be across these various environments within the school. Include the specific level of prompting or circumstances of how you need the student to complete the tasks. So, are you going to expect them to do this when given one verbal prompt? Are they expected to do it independently? Is it within highly structured therapy sessions? Is it in loosely structured tasks? So, be specific about what it is you expect. Measurable. Make sure you can really measure progress on the goal. You might be talking in terms of numbers of trials, such as they need to be able to do it 3 out of 5 trials, or percent accuracy. Maybe you want them to reach 80%, 90%. And keep in mind here the frequency. So, how often are you actually going to be able to work with this student? Many of our OT and PT students have pretty infrequent service times, so keep in mind how you're going to be able to measure that progress. If you're only seeing them once a month or every 6 weeks, can the teacher or the parent also help to measure progress? So keep all of that in mind when you're thinking about making your goals measurable. Achievable. Look at the baseline of the student's ability. Where are they now? And work to write goals that will be challenging but achievable. And consider how long you have to address the goal. Once again, how frequently will you see the student? Are you seeing them 3 times a week or once a semester? That's pretty different. So consider the level of prompting the student will require to be able to achieve that goal and how often you will see the student to work on the goals. Relevant. Make sure the goal relates to the student's area of need. So, going back to thinking about the evaluation and the qualifying criteria for why they qualify for OT or PT services, make sure that the goals relate to those qualifying areas of need and ensure that the goal supports the student's participation in school related activities. For example, therapists are only able to address self care skills that directly impact a child's education. This might be a little bit of a mind shift for those coming from a more clinical or hospital type setting. We can only target skills for self care that might be needed during the school day, such as self care skills at lunchtime or toileting or putting on and taking off your coat or backpack. Time bound. Include the time limit or the timing for when you expect the goal to be achieved. So, annual goals are expected to be met by the next annual IEP meeting. Short term objectives are expected to be met leading up to that annual goal. It's a good idea to view examples of goals at your school if possible because the style of goal writing, as far as annual goals and objectives, sometimes that differs a little bit school to school. Some schools typically just use annual goals, while others might have annual goals with short term objectives below. So check and see what your school prefers. Also, check the wording that is preferred at your school for the length of time. So, we always want to include a length of time in all of our goals, make them time bound. But check with your school or look at other goals there to see how they write that length of time. Do they write it as by the next annual IEP or within 36 instructional weeks? Or do they put a specific date, which would be the date of the next annual IEP meeting? So here are some examples. An annual goal might be by the next annual IEP, when given one verbal cue, the student will catch a small ball in 4 out of 5 trials during play activities as measured by the teacher or therapist observation. So you can see it's specific. We're saying exactly what we want the student to do, and we're saying how we're going to measure that progress. You want to check and make sure it's achievable based on the baseline data, and it's got to be relevant to the student's area of need, supporting them in their school environment, such as here during PE or outside play activities, and it needs to be time bound. So, what if your school does annual goals with short term objectives beneath? Here's an example of that. By the date of the next IEP, maybe that's the way the school writes the timeline, the student will independently sustain a tripod grasp with writing instruments when performing classroom writing tasks in 3 out of 4 opportunities observed over a 2-month period. So again, we've got all of those elements of the SMART goal there. And then we've got objectives below. Here would be the date of the first quarter in the IEP cycle. The student will demonstrate ability to sustain tripod grasp for writing tasks with moderate verbal and visual cueing in 50% of trials. By the date of the third quarter in the IEP cycle, the student will sustain a tripod grasp with minimal verbal and visual cueing in 50% of trials. So, at first they're requiring a lot of cueing, and then we're fading out that prompting to get them to achieve their annual goal. In this next section, we're going to talk about bridging the distance. And this is something that can be really hard to wrap your mind around when you first start working with students virtually. As an OT or a PT, you're used to having your hands physically on the student, prompting and manipulating them physically as needed. So, how do we address the student's gross motor and fine motor skills when you can't touch them and when you're at a distance? Well, the student and the therapist don't have to stay tied to the desk. There's a lot of different activities you can do moving around. You can get up, the student can get up, you can be on the floor, you can be jumping, doing exercises. You can utilize the caregiver when physical prompting or hand over hand assistance is needed. You can use manipulative kits with your students. Those can be really effective and important. And you can demonstrate fine motor skills, especially for OTs, with an external webcam. And we'll talk more about this all as we go into each section coming up. So, like I mentioned, you don't have to stay tied to the desk. You can incorporate lots of movement activities into your therapy sessions online. You can include activities that involve standing, being on the floor, and performing exercises as needed. And here I'd like to show a video of a PT session that includes movement activities. So let's take a look at this.
We're going to do 10 of these, then you get a break, okay? Remember this one? Okay. Okay? One. Good. Whoop, get your balance. Okay, come on, let's go. This is 4. And switch. And switch. Switch. Yeah. Switch. Good. Switch. Now go against the wall. I want you to do your wall sits, and then we're going to do baby shark. Yeah, arms up. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, up. Good. And again, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, up. That's 2. There we go. And again. And then we're going to roll to the side. And then back the other way. And then back the other way. Okay? There. Yeah. Slow, slow, slow. Okay. Keep your feet together. Keep your toes pointed to the ceiling. There you go.
So as you saw in that video, the therapist and the student are definitely not tied to the desk. They can get up and do lots of different movement activities that are appropriate for what that student needs to work on. Utilize the caregiver. Provide that coaching to the on-site person. So if you're working with a brick and mortar school, that's going to be more your teacher or your aide. If it's with a virtual academy, that's going to be the parent. Or what they call the learning coach, which is usually the parent, but it might be a grandparent, an aunt, an uncle, or just a family friend. Guide that caregiver in how to provide appropriate cues and physical prompting if needed. They are your hands, so you're going to teach them how to help the student. And this can really actually be an advantage in a lot of ways because when this works well, it can really help in carryover of skills because the caregiver feels confident about how to address the goals and how to prompt the student. You're only with the student for a very small percentage of their day or week or month or semester, that parent or that teacher or that teacher's aide, that person is going to be with them on a day-to-day basis. So teaching them how to prompt the student and how to help measure progress, that's going to be really key in getting carryover of skills. You may have to work to establish a good rapport, good relationship with that on-site facilitator. You might have to, kind of get them to buy in to this whole concept of teletherapy in general, or the whole concept of OT or PT. You're going to have, just like in any other setting, you're going to have some caregivers that are very gung-ho, ready to get right in there and help in every session. You're going to have the other extreme of the caregiver who's totally absent and very difficult to connect with. And then most folks are going to fall somewhere in between. So you might have to work a little bit to establish that relationship, and establish that kind of rapport where you really feel like a team and they really feel like they're working with you and helping you on your journey as you're both helping the student to be as successful as possible. Another way to bridge that distance when you're working virtually is to utilize manipulatives. So create a toolkit by gathering typical school or household items that you can use to address your students' goals. So, things you see there: pencils, scissors, paper, glue, erasers, whatever it might be, and provide a list of the items to the teacher or the family and ask that they gather similar items on their side in a plastic tub or box or bag. You want to choose items that they're likely to have free and easy access to in the school or home environment, because we don't want to require them to purchase items. Be sure to tailor the items in the kit to the goals of that specific student. So it's not necessarily one size fits all with a therapy toolkit, because every student is an individual and they have different types of goals. So you might want to tailor a kit to be items that will target strengthening or handwriting or scissor skills, whatever it is based on what that student's particular needs are. Typically, this toolkit idea is used for OT, but PTs can certainly incorporate this concept. They could create a toolkit to target gross motor skills. It might include a ball, balloons, bubbles, whatever makes sense for what you need to do with that student. The student should have their toolkit handy when they join the therapy session online. So, this is something you'd want to establish with the on site facilitator or the parent for our virtual academy students. You'd want to establish this when you first start working with the student. So then they gather all those items, they have their toolkit handy when they join the session, and then the therapist has their similar items on her or his end and can model use of those items to target the different goals. So, how do we do that? How do we demonstrate those activities on the therapist side? Well, you might be able to show those activities by aiming the camera on your computer in a certain way, or especially for OT, you can use an external webcam. And that can be super helpful so that you can demo fine motor activities, show your hands doing handwriting, doing exercises, whatever you need to do, and the student can see that on their side. So, if you're using an external webcam, which is really important for OT especially, here are some tips about it. Be sure you have your webcam plugged in and ready to go prior to the start of the session. You don't want to be fiddling with that and wasting time in the middle of your session time. Practice switching between external and internal cameras before beginning with the student. Get really familiar and comfortable with that. Be sure you know how to use the focus features on your webcam. The external webcam doesn't only need to be used for documents or handwriting. You can also just use it as a more mobile camera throughout the session, so to aim toward the floor or whatever you need for what you're demoing for the student. And lastly, but very important, be sure to follow the installation instructions on your camera. Typically, if you follow those guidelines that they provide when you get your external webcam, it will take you through all that you need to know. Collaborating with caregivers. With your brick and mortar schools, you're going to be coordinating primarily with teachers and aides, your on site facilitators. With the virtual academy or homeschooled students, You'll be coordinating primarily with the learning coach. And this is typically a parent, but it's not always the parent. It may be a grandparent, an aunt or uncle, or even a family friend. But it's the person who's responsible for making sure that that student is accessing their online curriculum and all of their classes, including their online therapy sessions. Some things to think about when working with caregivers via telepractice. It can be a great idea to send items to them to print off prior to the session. If the caregiver is amenable to that, if they're able to print things off, you'd want to check with them on that. And you want to do that before the session. Have that all prepped and ready if you would like to use some printables during your session or for homework for carryover. But you'd want to arrange that before the session so that you're not wasting valuable session time having the caregiver run to try to print something off. Also, meet that caregiver, the teacher, or the parent where they are. You're going to have to feel out the dynamics in each different situation. So be sensitive to the fact that many caregivers, whether it's a teacher or a parent, may be really stressed. They may have a lot on their plate. So, although their participation in your therapy sessions may be quite high on your priority list, it might be pretty low on theirs. So be sensitive to that and understanding that you may need to take some time to develop that relationship and build that trust. And also understand that you're going to get great participation from some caregivers and not so much from others who may just not have quite as much time to invest. It's a great idea to send written recommendations in an email, and this allows them to reference it when they have time, if they don't have time to speak with you, during the session. Also, even if you did discuss it with them previously, having it written down, those recommendations, can help so that they have something to refer back to if they forgot or they need a reminder. And it provides continued support between sessions. Many of our OT and PT students have pretty infrequent service times. So, having something written that the caregiver can refer back to as far as supports and recommendations, in addition to just the IEP goals, that can be really helpful and supportive as they work with their student. Be sure you communicate with the entire team. Even though we're working virtually, we can still act as an IEP team. You can communicate with the teachers, the parents, or caregivers, of course, and other therapists if possible. You want to communicate with the entire team to determine appropriate goals for the student. Remember, your OT and PT goals have to be in line with supporting the student accessing their academics and being successful in that academic world. So that can often involve coordination with the teachers and finding out what they're struggling with, what are the teachers working on, and working to support that in your sessions. Include caregivers in measurement of progress whenever possible. That way, if you're just seeing the student once a week or once a month, that teacher or that parent can help measure the progress more on a daily basis. Utilize teachers and parents to help carry goals over to other settings. So, you're working with the student for a really small amount of time just during your sessions. So, you can utilize those caregivers to help establish those skills in various settings across context to help that student really develop and internalize those skills. Next, let's take a look at some therapy ideas and types of activities that can be utilized during your OT and PT sessions. Here's a clip from an OT session, and in this clip, you'll see that a variety of activities are used in one session.
Today, we're going to do some handwriting. Do you have your scissors too for some cutting? I get to work with a lot of different students. So I have students be pen pals with other students. So your pen pal's name is Jenny. What kind of question do you think you'd want to ask her for your first question?
What's your favorite color or something?
What's your favorite color? That sounds good. Now, let me see how you hold your pencil. Can I see? Good job. Can you put it up towards the screen so I can see it okay? Nice. And it's a nice and sharp pencil too, so you're good. Okay. So at the very top, you can write, Dear Jenny. We're going to cut right along the line. So this will work on your scissors skills.
This is going to be a little bit tough.
Yeah, it is a little tough. So you'll start at the end without the balloon. Okay, and you've got your scissors, and you cut right along the lines. You're doing really well. So which one did you think was the hardest?
The hardest was the zigzag, definitely.
Hardest was the zigzags. Yeah, you're right. That's really cool, though. Stand up out of your chair. And open your nose.
This is hard. How would you do that?
Like this.
There we
Yeah.
go.
You can stretch your hands up high, and stretch to the side.
Oh my
And
gosh.
the other side.
Oh my gosh.
And now bring your hands back straight and kind of kick them like this. Kick your hands. And then kind of shake them like this. Open and closed. High five. You did awesome.
Of course, every student's needs are different, so you will need to individualize your sessions and activities to address your students' particular goals. And students show varied levels of participation. Some may readily participate in therapy tasks, while others may need a high level of motivation. So you will need to be strategic in your session planning based on each student's needs. Now let's take a look at some more on-screen therapy activity ideas that you can incorporate into your teletherapy sessions. Here's an example of an activity site called Go Noodle, where you can find many great motor activities that are easy to incorporate into online sessions. Here's an example of a fun video called Twist and Shout.
Greetings, my friends. It is I, Maximo. There are times when I want to stand straight and whisper. But right now is the time I want to twist and shout. Hit it. Are you ready to do some twisting and shouting? I am. Let's shake it up, baby. Shake it up, baby. Twist and shout. Twist and shout. Come on, come on, come on.
So that gives you an idea of that particular activity. And I want to show you one more example from this site. This one is called Mood Walk, and it's a little different. It can be used to target various skills such as body awareness, gross motor skills, focus, and emotional regulation.
Everyone feels emotion, and since we all feel them, it's good to get to know them and name them so then we can handle them.
That's why we're going to take a mood walk.
Yes.
Word? We're going to mood walk?
No. We're going to mood walk.
Mood.
Not moonwalk.
Oh.
But, you don't have to feel the emotions. You just have to name them and then move with them.
Right. And if at any time these emotions feel like they're too much, just take a pause and join back when you feel ready.
All right, come on. Let's walk in place together. Just casual, like you're chilling, a regular walk.
Now, I'm going to name an emotion, and you walk like that emotion.
Got it. Let's do it.
Walk like you're impatient.
Jittery steps. Walk side to side. Then back. Crunched up face. Tight jaw. Wring your hands. Look at your watch. You are impatient.
Go back to neutral.
Springy steps to up on toes. Smile on your face. Arms open to sides. You are happy.
Now go back to neutral. Walk like you're mad.
Loud stomps. Tight hands. Tense face.
That gives you an idea of how that works, and it continues on to give more opportunities. If you aren't already familiar with Go Noodle, that's what both of these videos were both from, gonoodle.com. If you aren't already familiar with that site, check it out, and you'll see that there are a host of really engaging and useful activities to target various OT and PT goals. You can use fun on-screen games and resources to get your students up and moving during your sessions. For example, here's an e-therapy pirate-themed movement game. It comes with digital pirate-themed movement cards. So you can have the student do the movements and then they get to take a turn with the game. There are movable game pieces, so you can move the game pieces around the board, or you can use your video conferencing platform to give the student control of the keyboard and mouse so that they can move their game piece around the board. And you can even use free online spinners that are customizable or digital dice. There are many options out there that you can easily find in a quick Google search. You can incorporate these into your play with the on-screen game board to really make it even more interactive and fun. Most video conferencing platforms have annotation tools built in that you can use to type or draw on the screen. So be sure to incorporate use of those tools when appropriate. For example, here is a PT goal review sheet, and you could display something like this on your screen when screen sharing with the student. Then either you or the student can use on-screen annotation tools to type directly onto the screen to complete the activity together in discussing what you're working on in therapy. It can also be beneficial at times to use videos during your sessions. You can, of course, demonstrate movement activities using your own webcam, but sometimes it's motivating for students to show a dance video or demonstrations of other kids performing certain movement tasks as a model. You can find lots of great content out there that you can find on YouTube. Pink Oatmeal is a physical therapy site that has some great video content as well. So you can screen share with the student and play videos such as this during your therapy sessions. And be sure to use a safe YouTube link for your therapy sessions. To do this, you can go to a safe YouTube site, such as what you see here, and input the video link you would like to share with your student. This allows you to send the link safely to a parent or teacher for home practice, and it also allows you to display the YouTube video on the screen during your therapy session without any ads or potential distractions that might pop up on the screen. You can incorporate visual timers on the screen as well if you need a student to maybe hold a pose for a certain number of seconds, or if they need to keep doing repetitions of a particular exercise for a specified amount of time. Seeing that visually, like you see here on the screen, can sometimes be really beneficial for students to see that visually rather than just you as the therapist telling them when their time is up. And you can find various free visual on-screen timers with a quick online search. You can also use on-screen activities to address fine motor and visual motor skills for OT sessions. Here's an example of an e-therapy Trace the Path activity where students can use their finger or stylus if they're using a touchscreen device to trace the dotted lines. If you give the student keyboard and mouse control through the video conferencing platform, then the student could also use their mouse to trace the lines or trackpad, and you would see their cursor move on the screen. Here's another example of an activity to target fine motor and visual motor coordination with this Trace the Shapes activity. And you can also let the student use on-screen annotation tools to draw directly on the screen to trace the shapes. So that's another way to use this type of activity in a teletherapy format. You can get even more creative in using annotation tools with your video conferencing platform. Many of them have a shape tool that you could use to mark items on the screen. For example, you could use this e-therapy Spot the Difference picture scene to target visual discrimination. And either you or the student could use the shape tool or the drawing tool to mark the items that are different in the scene. Digital puzzles can also be really useful to address visual perception skills. Here's an example of a drag and drop puzzle scene that could be utilized to target visual closure skills with students as you work together to complete the on-screen puzzle. You may be familiar with the paper form of scratch art, where you use a sharp stick or hard object to scratch that black paper to reveal a picture underneath. Well, you can do the same thing digitally, which is great to incorporate into online sessions, and it's way less messy as well. These activities can be used to target visual spatial goals or letter formation, or even just as a motivational activity or brain break. So let's wrap it up here with some important tips and takeaways. Be sure you incorporate the student's likes and dislikes into your therapy plan. Allow them to have input in what tasks you choose for the session. This can really help to get buy in from the student and help them to be motivated to participate. Have a plan B for each session if plan A doesn't pan out. Some kids may just be having a day where the activity that they usually love, not so much today. So have a backup plan. Incorporate different tasks into each session. For example, 40 minutes of scissor skills is a lot of scissor skills in one sitting. So you might work on that for a little while and then switch gears and do something a little different. Be creative. Would you do a scavenger hunt for this child if you were seeing them on site? Okay, well, let's think outside the box. How can we incorporate ideas like that in the virtual setting? And as we've mentioned, include the caregiver in the session as appropriate and when possible. Use a combination of computer-based tasks and hands-on tasks. So just like a lot of those examples that I showed, use a variety of things to keep the student motivated and engaged as you target those therapy goals. Thank you so much for your time, and be sure to check out the eTherapy resources to get all of our eTherapy original materials. You can access these by selecting Resources and Therapist Tools from your therapist dashboard. And don't forget to follow eTherapy on social media. Check us out on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram to get free teletherapy tips and tricks and to stay in the loop on all the important eTherapy and special education news. We look forward to seeing you there soon.